Hey, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at getting the best guitar tone you possibly can with the least amount of gear. Now, tone is going to be subjective. What I think is like the holy grail guitar tone, you may not care for. And what you think is, the holy grail guitar tone, I may not care for. So, I'm just going to give you some broad strokes. I'm not trying to get you to play the gear that I play or go after the sound that I go after. Take what I'm telling you and apply it to the sound that you're hearing in your head. And just kind of use this information to narrow down all the gear that's out there to choose from and make some good informed choices. So, first and foremost, if we're going to talk about tone in general, tone comes from your hands. If we put David Gilmour and Carlos Santana and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Tobin Abasi all on the same exact guitar and amplifier setup, each one of them is going to sound different. David Gilmour will sound like David Gilmour, Carlos Santana is going to sound like Santana, etc. It's in the fingers, it's in your note choices, it's in your note durations, your phrasing. So, if we're going to talk about tone, we need to kind of get that out of the way. That all the gear in the world isn't going to make you sound better if you haven't spent time working on your left and right hand technique and really are able to coax a sweet, articulate sound out of the instrument. These things are amplified. There's no reason to bang on it and play hard, even if you're playing heavy music. It's best to just let the guitar and the amplifier do the work. Okay? So I am currently plugged straight in. I have my 1995 Ibanez AS80, which is like a Gibson 335 copy, before they kind of had to change the body style to prevent lawsuits. And I've upgraded all the internals. I saw this guitar, I fell in love with it, I loved the neck, loved the way it played, but it had really, the cheap mid-90s electronics in it. This guitar's 30 years old, so stuff was kind of, given out and wasn't working as well as it should. And once I got this amplifier, this is a Friedman Dirty Shirley Mini 20 watt all tube hand wired amplifier that is based on a Marshall JTM that had been modified to push more into Marshall Plexi gain territory. So this is kind of like a mini Marshall Plexi. And once I started using this new head, this guitar sounded really bad. I could tell it was the weak link in my tone. So I put Seymour Duncan Alnico 2 Pro pickups, and I'll explain to you why I chose those specifically. And I redid all the wiring with what's called 50s style wiring. A lot of the most sought after, cherished electric guitars are late 50s, early 60s Gibson not SGs, but Gibson Les Pauls, 335s, and the original run of the what is now called the SG, the 61, 62 Les Paul that had the double cutaway with the pointy horns. All those guitars had what were called patent applied for humbucking pickups. They had a little sticker that said patent applied for on the back. And they're generally just called PAF. And for decades, guitar companies and pickup manufacturers have been trying to recreate that PAF tone. And that's what these are. These are kind of Seymour Duncan's version of that original late 50s PAF pickup. And then I have 50s style wiring with a modern guitar wiring system. When you turn down your volume knob, you're going to experience treble loss, and your tone will get kind of murky and muddy, and you'll lose your treble. You'll lose that vibrancy and that attack, that snap, and that articulation. And so you have two choices. You can get a treble bleed and have that circuit put in to your modern wiring, or you can get a 50s style wiring harness that I'm not going to go into the details, but the way it's wired, it minimizes treble bleed automatically. And also when you do that, when you upgrade your wiring, you get better pots that, a lot of less expensive guitars, there's not much difference between 10, 5, and 1. It's kind of all or nothing. And with upgraded like 500K CTS pots, you get the full value range of the pot, the volume or tone. So you're going to hear the difference on 10, and then you turn down to like 9, and you'll hear a distinguishable difference in your amplifier. Turn down to 8, you'll hear a difference. Turn down to 7, it'll start cleaning up. Turn down to 5, down to 3. Every step is usable and provides a different amount of gain and tone going to your amplifier. So a lot of guitar players in the blues rock kind of vein really have this gold standard of running your guitar straight into a kind of high gain, medium gain amplifier and just cranking the amplifier up and getting all your distortion and overdrive that way, and not using boost pedals or overdrive pedals or distortion or fuzz, any those things you don't need when you've got a hot rodded tube amp that's going to give you all the gain that you want. And you can, if you want a clean tone, you just roll your volume down on your guitar and that becomes your clean channel. And then you can on the fly adjust that and bring it up. You'll see, everybody doing it. Stevie Ray Vaughan, B.B. King, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Derek Trucks, Warren Haynes, on and on and on. Everybody in that kind of blues rock, classic rock, hard rock vein uses a guitar straight into the amp. They may have a boost pedal, like a tube screamer, or like an EP boost or a treble booster, but a lot of them don't. Like with this head, there's absolutely no reason for me to have a boost pedal. It just, you'll hear it. I don't need it. And so let's talk for a minute about pickups, because not all pickups are the same. And you should know before you go buy your next guitar or your first electric guitar or whatever, the difference. So Fender guitars generally have what are called single coil pickups. They're about the width of your finger. So this is a double coil pickup called a humbucker. So a single coil is about half the size. And single coil pickups in guitars like Stratocasters, Telecasters, etc. are going to be more snappy and trebly and articulate, and they cut through the mix really well, and they're great for R&B, funk, blues, classic rock. David Gilmour, Pink Floyd, he played a Strat. Stevie Ray Vaughan played a Strat. Eric Clapton's been playing Stratocasters forever. Jeff Beck played a Stratocaster forever. So that's going to give you a very different kind of percussive, cleaner sound, but it also comes with a hum, like a 60 cycle hum. And you have to use kind of two of your single coil pickups together to cancel out that hum. So Seth Lover at Gibson back in the 50s fixed that problem by inventing the humbucking pickup, that PAF, patent applied for, we were talking about. And it's just basically two coils, two single coils wrapped together, and one is making the other, they're working together and canceling the hum. So that's why it's called a humbucker. And with a humbucking pickup, you're going to get a warmer, kind of darker, sweeter tone than you do with single coils, which is why they're often preferred for blues, blues rock, hard rock. They're a little bit hotter output than single coils, so that's why they're often favored by rock and metal players. So pickups, you kind of need to know something about the magnets, because that's where pickups start to differ. This pickup set I have has what's called an Alnico 2 magnet, and that is what was standard in the PAFs, the early Gibson electrics from 58, 59, 60, etc. And the thing about an Alnico 2 magnet, it's the weakest of all the pickup magnets. So if you want a lot of sustain out of your guitar, you want a guitar that has you want a pickup that has a weak magnetic pull on the strings. Because as you're holding that note, your pickup is generating an electromagnetic pull on the string, resisting it vibrating freely. So it's going to cut the amount of sustain you have. So an Alnico 2 is the weakest humbucker magnet that is used, and it allows for greater sustain. They also tend to be underwound a little bit and not very hot, which means you're not putting a hot signal into your amp. You're putting kind of a medium hot signal in there, which isn't driving the front of the amp as hard, which then allows you to turn up your power amp section and get power tube distortion, and have a little bit more clean breakup than just full on fuzz face super distortion from a hot pickup. So Alnico pickups climb in number, Alnico 3, 4, 5, and the higher you go, the hotter the pickup gets. And also you'll kind of see that they'll wind them more, and the more winds of copper wire around the magnet, the hotter the pickup is, the more output it has, the louder it is, the more it distorts the front end of the amp. After that, you have ceramic pickups and active pickups. And you'll see active pickups mostly for like heavy metal, for like Slayer, Arch Enemy, Napalm Death, super heavy stuff. And an active pickup has a 9-volt battery inside the guitar, electrifying the pickups and powering them. So they're sending this super hot signal into the front of the amp. And for those guys that are playing super heavy stuff, they're using what are called high gain amps that are just even hotter than this thing. And they're just meant to be crushingly heavy and loud. And that's called a high gain amplifier. So let's talk about amps, since we segued in out of pickups and wiring. There are basically two types of amplifiers, American and British. It doesn't mean that the amplifier was made in America or Great Britain. It has to do with when electric amps were first being made by Leo Fender in California, and he had a certain set of components from America that he was building amps with. And then in England, Jim Marshall was trying to fix Fender amps for players over there and couldn't get the parts. They have a different set of transistors and transformers and capacitors and power tubes. It's all different values over there in Europe. So he decided just to build his own amplifier. So he based it on a Fender Bassman, but he put in British components, and it sounded completely different than a Fender. It gave us the Marshall sound, the Marshall JTM, which is what this is based off of. This is based off a hot rodded JTM. And so when they say American or British, what they kind of mean is what are the components and the properties of the amp, not where it was built. That was the case in the 60s and early 70s, you know, when British amps were built in England and American amps were built in America. But, you know, now they're built overseas, and this is an American amp, hand-wired, hand-built in America, but it's a British style amplifier because it's based off of Marshall, and it's got all the British components. So you kind of need to know what tone you're after and what you're trying to get out of your amplifier. An American style amp is going to generally have 6L6 or 6V6 power tubes. This will give you a lot of headroom. Headroom is the ability for the amplifier to stay clean at loud volumes. And that's what Fenders are famous for. Brilliant, chimey, clean tone at ear-blistering volumes. They just don't break up. There are some newer kind of Fenders that are based on mid-gain amps. Some even have British-style power tubes that break up earlier and are more of blues amps. But for the most part, the American sound is high headroom and lots of clean tone. They make great pedal platforms because you can always put an overdrive or distortion or fuzz pedal in front of it and then distort the amp. And then when you want your pristine clean tone, you just kick off your fuzz pedal and now you've got a clean amp. This amp won't do that. There is no clean channel on this amp. There's 3 channels: gain, more gain, and even more gain. So this is an amp that's meant to capture that late 60s, early 70s blues rock, heavy rock guitar tone. It's not meant to be clean and chimey. If I want clean, I roll my volume down and then I still have a kind of dirty, clean sound. You know, I play heavy blues rock and psychedelic rock, and I don't need a clean sound. So why bother? British amps, conversely, are going to have generally EL84 or EL34 power tubes. Sometimes KT88s will be swapped out, but generally they're ELs. EL power tubes have less headroom, but they break up quicker, and they will give you power tube saturation, power tube distortion when you turn the master volume up. And that's what gives you that glorious Marshall stack hard rock sound, you know, is those EL tubes being cranked and really cooking. As far as preamp tubes, almost all amps are the same. They all pretty much use 12AX7. So those are the 2 basic amps. The last thing you kind of have to worry about is your speaker cabinet. That's the final stage. Again, I would do some homework and just listen to examples. I just listened to a lot of speaker demos in cabinets, and I heard the Celestion Creamback, and it had the kind of breakup that I was looking for. Not as harsh as the greenbacks or vintage 30s. What I strongly suggest is you listen closely to guitar tones that you love, that inspire you, that make you want to play. Narrow it down to like 3 players who just had your holy grail tone. And then read interviews, or there's a Premier Guitar YouTube channel that does gear layouts, and they'll go backstage with an artist before a show and look at all their gear and talk about all their pedals and amps and guitars and stuff like that. So do some homework and then look at what overlaps if you have three guitar players who have similar tones, they're probably going to have similar properties, right? They're probably all using British style amps, or they're all using American style amps, or they're all using high gain amps, or you know what I mean? Or they're all using PAF style pickups, or whatever. So try to spot the similarities in the gear that is creating the tone you're after. That way, when you go to buy a guitar, go to buy an amp, you're not wasting your money on equipment that isn't going to give you what you want. Really zero in on the tone you're after and then get that gear. So let's talk about buying gear real quick. You kind of, unless you've got a bunch of money and you can just go buy brand new gear and get exactly what you want, brand new, you're going to have to be like kind of the rest of us working musicians and people on limited budgets, and you have to kind of play the trading game. So you get yourself a beginner guitar and a beginner amp, and then you stick with it a couple months, you get better, and then you decide, I want to upgrade, so you trade in your guitar for a intermediate guitar. And when you trade in, like let's say you bought a guitar new for $600. They're going to sell that guitar for about $400. They're going to give you 50% of what they're going to sell the guitar for. So they're going to give you $200 for your guitar that you paid $600 for a year ago or whatever. So buying new is always kind of a gamble. You're always going to lose money if you're in the trading kind of cycle. I only recommend buying new if you find a piece of equipment that is exactly what you want. You've listened to demos, you've played it in a guitar store or whatever, and it is dead on exactly what you want. You won't need another guitar after you buy this one, then buy that guitar new. Okay? So I just did that. I haven't purchased a new instrument since 1990. And I bought a bass specifically for music school and my career after, and that was my bass for 25 years. And since in all that interim, I never purchased another new instrument until about a month ago when a very limited edition artist model of a guitar that's only available in Japan was being released here in the States. And it's kind of like this guitar on steroids. So it already had the pickups. I got them to do the same kind of 50s style wiring harness before they ship it out to me. So it's everything that I was looking for in a guitar. And it just happened to be available. So I jumped on it. And they were limited. And I didn't want to lose the opportunity to get one. So I just bit the bullet and bought it, But I'm never going to need another guitar. I've got that guitar. I've got this guitar. They're both exactly what I'm looking for. I'll never need to swap them out and get something else. I've got my guitar, my amp, and my cabinet settled. So when you get into that trading cycle as you build up your gear, and it may take you a couple years, you have your intermediate guitar and your beginner amp, so you trade your amp to an intermediate amp, then you trade your guitar for an even better guitar, then you trade your amp for an even better amp, and then maybe you finally trade your guitar for a top of the line professional be all end all guitar, trade your amp for a top of the line amp, and then you're done. It may take you a couple years to get to that point. Saving money, trading, waiting on gear. If you're going to buy used gear, patience is a virtue. I don't have a lot of money to spend on gear. I have to really pick and choose where I spend my money. And I did a bunch of research for about 6 months looking at amplifier heads that were going to give me exactly what I was looking for. And I narrowed it down to this exact model. And then I found out that they're out of production. The company still exists. They still make tons of amps, but they don't make this specific amp anymore. And I was like, man, what are the chances that one of those is going to pop up used in my hometown where I could buy it? Because I don't buy amplifiers off Reverb anymore. I bought a really expensive bass tube head online through Reverb, and the shipping company dropped it. I don't buy guitars or amps unless I can play them in person. That's just me. So I'd seen enough videos and I'd read enough reviews, and then I knew that I wanted this amp. And I was watching the website on my local music around, and I check it every couple of days when I'm in the market for gear. And lo and behold, this thing showed up for sale. And I was like, whoa. I saw it on a Sunday night. I was there Monday morning, first thing before the store opened. I was not going to lose this amp. I traded in my amp towards it, and I ended up getting it for $800. So that's a steal, $800 for this top of the line, hand wired, best components, boutique rock machine. Same thing kind of happened when I bought this cabinet. This is a Morgan Amplification 212 with Celestion creambacks, which are my preferred speakers, as opposed to the general greenbacks or vintage 30s you find in a lot of rock amps. And these things are handmade right outside Nashville. So a lot of the Nashville studio and touring guitarists use Morgan amps, and they go for about $1,100 new. And the guy was selling this thing on Reverb for $800, and I was like, that's kind of out of my price range for a speaker cabinet. So I kept an eye on it, and sure enough, after like 2 months, he was going on tour in a couple days, and he dropped the price to $475. So I snatched this thing up for like $500 with shipping. Just ridiculous deal, So I've got about $1,200, $1,300 in my head and this cabinet, and I'll never need to buy other head and cabinet again. My tone quest is complete. So I'm going to play for a little bit. I want to kind of give you an idea of what my tone sounds like running straight into my guitar. I have a little bit of reverb on my reverb pedal, because reverb makes everything sound better, but I don't have any distortion pedals. And if I solo a little bit, I'll kick on my compressor pedal, which drives the front of the amp a little bit. It gives it a little bit more gain, but it gives it a lot of sustain, which my tone, I was after three things. For a medium, what I would consider my clean rhythm tone, I was after that kind of ZZ Top, Tres Hombres era, Billy Gibbons breakup. Not distorted, but just a kind of broken up, saturated, kind of clean sound. And then for my heavy rhythm, I wanted the Alex Lifeson from Rush Working Man rhythm tone, which was recorded with a 335 guitar like this and a 50 watt Marshall Plexi cranked all the way up. So I can pretty much nail that tone with this setup. And then finally, for my solo sound, I wanted that early Santana / Eric Clapton woman tone, which comes from using a PAF style neck pickup with the tone knob rolled all the way off to 0 and the volume knob rolled all the way up to 10. And that's often called the woman tone. Why, I don't know. So let me just kind of play for you a little bit and give you an idea of my sound that I'm working with that I'm able to get running my guitar straight into my amp with no other pedals. So this would be my like clean, dirty-ish kind of ZZ Top rhythm. So there's that. And I turn it all the way up, and I get that kind of Alex Lifeson working man. Plenty heavy enough for me, for what I'm doing, for the whole classic rock, blues rock thing. That's just, I can get into Sabbath territory. So that's just a guitar with not even hot pickups. These are underwound PAF pickups just running into a super modified kind of Marshall amp, you know? And I'm gonna throw on my compressor and just kind of solo a little bit. And the compressor is just gonna give me a little more punch and a lot more sustain. Here it is without the compressor. Okay, now here it is with the compressor, and I'm using an MXR Dynacomp. Of sustain. So there you go. That is how to get a good guitar tone with a minimal amount of gear. And it really comes down to being cognizant of what every aspect of the signal path, pickups, wiring, head, cabinet, are going to do to affect your tone. I was just editing this video and almost about to post it when I realized I had spent the entire video talking about tube amplifiers. You have two choices when it comes to amplifiers. One that has vacuum tubes driving the preamp and the power amp, or one that is solid state. So tube watts are exponentially louder than solid state. This is, like I said, a 20 watt tube amp, and I'm running it through a attenuator that steps down the decibels so I can turn the master volume up and get tube saturation and that wonderful, glorious, thick, rich, harmonically dense tube distortion that you can only get from a tube amp. This amp, without using the attenuator, I have to run the volume around 2 or 3 before it starts bleeding out into the street. To keep it at that same sound pressure level and same volume, but to get the power tube distortion, you run it through an attenuator. And then I can turn my master volume up to 6. I don't want it any higher because I have my gain on 10 and I'm running this on the second highest gain channel. I don't have it on the ultra high gain. I've got it more on the brighter plexi channel. So the gain is all the way up on 10, and I didn't want any more distortion because it would just get muddy. So, and I don't want to burn through my power tubes that fast. So I keep the master on 6, which there's no way I could play this amp on 6 here in the neighborhood. Maybe live on stage with a loud drummer. This thing is crushingly loud at like 5. So that's the point of an attenuator. What about modeling amps? I know a lot of people love their modeling amps and they spend a lot of money on them. I've heard like a fractal, I think it's called. I am not into modeling amps. I'm strictly into tube amps. And I'll explain why in a second. But I heard a modeling amp. And the guy was going through some like, famous amps. Marshall Plexi, Marshall JTM, Marshall JC800. I played through it. And while it sounded like a plexi, the tone I was going for, it didn't feel anything like a plexi. It didn't feel like a tube amp. A tube amplifier has sag and bloom. I know, weird, innocuous kind of terms. But when you hear a note coming out of a solid state amplifier, which is what a modeling amplifier is, the note may be accurate, but it's going to be sterile and cold. Whereas a tube amplifier, that same note sounds like it was dipped in 20-year-old bourbon and then wrapped in chocolate. It's just sweet and smoky, and it has character and vibe, and it reacts to your playing. There's kind of a sag, especially if your amplifier has a tube rectifier. You'll really notice what's called sag, where you'll hit the note and it'll kind of drop a little bit into the lower range. It'll kind of not bottom out and get farty and low, but it just kind of drops and then rises and blooms. And especially if you just like hold a big open power cord, that thing will just sag and then swell, And same thing with like big sustaining notes. You just hear this swell, this violin like sustain. And when you play with dynamics, your tube amp is going to respond. The harder you play with your right hand, it's going to push the front of the amp, and the amp is going to bark. It's going to give you more distortion and breakup the harder you play. So that's what your attack, your right hand technique, great amps respond to your playing. Great tube amps. And in my experience, you don't get that feel and that responsiveness from a modeler amp. No matter how accurate it may sound, it just doesn't feel the same. That's my 2 cents on modelers. This video is about how to get great tone with the least amount of gear. And to my ears, this is just me, but millions of other guitar players over the last 4 decades can't be wrong. Tube amps came out in the early 40s and people are still using them. They're still the gold standard of sumptuous, rich guitar tone. So take that for what it's worth.